Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 148 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, that is Gavin and Fia, and have you guys ever done something that you know is going to be completely obsolete by the time other people get to hear it?
Yeah, kinda, I guess.
I feel like that's what we're doing today.
Yeah.
Like we're gonna do the sciencey podcast episode. Yeah, we got some cool stuff coming out for people.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming out on Wednesday, November 6th.
But we are recording it on Monday, November 4th.
This is true.
So
who knows?
Congrats, and or I am so very sorry. Yeah. There's not much else to say about that.
I'm going to say congrats either way, especially if Gavin is saying I'm so very sorry, because I want to make sure that I'm in the good graces of Dear Leader.
I'm just saying, like I said, but in our little chat before we started recording, in Ann Seltzer we trust. So if you understand what that means, I'm so sorry you live the life that you do. Get some help. I know I do. I need it.
Like I told Gavin before we started recording, Gavin says in Ann Seltzer we trust, and I was like, maybe you, not me.
I mean, from the little I know about pollsters, she is one of the better ones, if not one of the best ones.
That is generally what I've seen, and also,
but hey,
I don't know, man.
I'm just saying, I gotta have a little hope. That's something that Liz and I have talked about a little bit. Is that she's, she doesn't want to hear much about political news or whatever. She doesn't really want to stay up to date because it's just gonna make her sad and frustrated. But I'm like, I need to hear things because I need hope. Otherwise, I'm just not gonna be doing well. So I'm like, I need some kind of hope. All this, like Mike said, is going to be obsolete because, if this goes out Wednesday morning, there's a very solid chance that we still won't know who won. So who knows? Anyway, we're talking about Beetles today.
Hooray!
Like the Beatles, or
no, like the little bugs, little buggy guys.
Maybe we should talk about the Beatles. All right.
Maybe. I mean, 2 episodes time is a Mike Takes the Wheel episode, so you got 1 month to figure it out.
That'd be exciting.
Can he do it?
I mean, 2 of them are dead, at least so far.
Right.
So,
I mean, hey, a month is a lot of time.
All right. The thoughts that jumped into my head are going to stay in my head. Let's do some housekeeping.
Yeah. So don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube to give us feedback about the show and any future topics you would like to hear on the podcast. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, which we would absolutely love, please be sure to fill out the guest form. All of this stuff can be found in the show notes. Gavin, what do we have next for episode topic?
So next episode, we are talking about poison and venom. This is something that came up a little bit. I'm not going to talk too much about poisons and toxins and things in this episode, but with beetles, there's a lot of beetles who are like lightly poisonous, especially to the things that are their predators. And so that just got me thinking. I'm like, there's a lot of nasty stuff that animals and plants out in the world get up to that they can stab you with, or you eat them and things are bad. So it's going to be next episode. It's going to be pretty morbid.
Sweet.
Yeah. So
looking forward to it.
Yeah, with the house kept a little bit. Mike, our resident high school history teacher, what happened today in history?
So you look through today in history, it's a whole lot of election stuff.
Sure.
A whole lot of the time. With some other stuff thrown in here, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, that film premiered in 2005 on this date. A couple other stuff happened, but one thing that just made me chuckle, it was one of those things I chuckled and did not want to look any further into it because I assumed that it makes more sense when you look into it. But on the website that I use here, in 2018, November 6th, 2018, it just says Prince Charles on slavery. And in the in the description below that, Great Britain's Prince Charles calls slavery an incredible stain, but stopped short of an apology in Ghana.
I do remember that, yeah.
I'm glad. Okay, here's the thing, Gav. I'm glad you remember that. Don't tell me anything more, because reading that sentence, like, just A+ work. Whoever wrote that.
Yeah. I mean, I won't tell you any more context about that. I know there was a similar thing, like the last time he visited Australia. Not quite slavery, but just all the terrible stuff that the British did to the native Australians when they got there and were setting stuff up.
You gotta give the monarchy.
They've been consistent, you know.
You gotta give the monarchy a little bit of grace. Like, they've got so much to apologize for. Like,
yeah,
like they've got to like dole these apologies out in little increments and make sure they leave some for the next ones that come. Like, you know, you can't expect them to apologize for everything.
You can. I think you can.
All right, Fia, talk to me about the
Seagrass
Corner.
Yeah.
Yeah. So today on Seagrass Corner, I want to talk about the Atlantic spadefish. This is a really tough one to pretend to know that I know scientific words. So this is Chaetodipterus faber.
That looks right. It's probably keto.
Yeah, Chaetodipterus faber. Yeah. So Atlantic spadefish, everybody. The scientific name is derived from the Greek words kete, I guess, meaning mane, and dipteros, meaning with two fins. So essentially the spadefish, it looks like, you know, on like a deck of cards you have spades.
Mm-hmm.
If you just turn it 90 degrees, that's what a spadefish looks like.
Okay, so it's kind of like a flounder, but slightly different. Is it flat?
It's flat, but it swims in the water column.
Huh.
So okay. It's almost like what are those, sunfish or moonfish?
Oh, like the mola.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But it swims like vertically, like, so it's
okay. So it's like laterally compressed. It's not like turned sideways like a flounder.
No,
okay.
It is laterally compressed. Correct.
Cool.
But yeah, it's in the shape. If you look at it from its side view, it's in the shape of a spade that is also turned sideways. Yeah.
That sounds cool.
Yeah. These guys are also called angelfish, white angelfish, three-tailed porgy, ocean cobbler, and moonfish. The Atlantic.
I feel like the people who give common names to fish and the people who give common names to birds should just have a fight. Because people, if you, dear listeners, if you aren't familiar with that many common names of birds and fish, they are so funny out of context. Like, they make excellent insults.
Yeah.
So, like, calling somebody out of context, like, as an insult, oh, you three-tailed porgy, that just sounds like an excellent insult.
Yeah, it does.
Anyway, sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. I was going to say I'm a real big fan of the ocean cobbler.
Yeah.
That sounds delicious. So the Atlantic spadefish feeds on small benthic inverts, so crustaceans, mollusks, worms. They also feed on plankton in the water column. This species of spadefish is endemic to the western Atlantic Ocean, so they're found off the coast of the southeastern U.S. as far as Massachusetts and the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. They can also be found in Bermuda and east coast of Brazil. They like to live commonly in shallow waters. And then lastly, their fun fact, they are the symbol of the North Carolina Aquarium.
Neat.
Yeah. That's a spadefish.
Cool. So thanks for Seagrass Corner there, learning about spadefish and also some adding some potential Victorian insults to your repertoire, dear listeners. So let's get into the main topic of the episode. Not the Beatles, but Beetles. So formally, this is like the only time you're going to hear me say this word because it's, a science word, and Beetles is just a word people know. So the technical name for beetles is the order Coleoptera. Like I said, beetles, Coleoptera, we're just calling it beetles. Beetles are, so far, the most diverse group of animals in the history of the world.
Yep, I believe it.
Depends a little bit on how you count it, but also, potentially more diverse than any group of plants, any group of fungi, or even things like bacteria and protists, although we don't have a great way of quantifying bacteria and protists species. Some of them are easier than others. Some of them are nearly impossible because different species of bacteria can exchange genetic information with each other. Bacteria are very weird. But very sure, at least for animals, beetles are, way up there, the most diverse group of animals. So how many species?
That's nuts.
How many species do you think there are?
More than 12.
Millions.
You're not wrong. So,
Million seems like it's too much. I'm going to go with high four figures.
High four figures? So you're thinking like tens of thousands?
No,
or thousands.
I'm thinking, like between 4 and 8,000.
Okay, so for context, there are about 30,000 species of fish.
God, mother of.
So,
1 million.
Of the scientifically described species, which is going to be important, there are over 400,000 species.
Oh. That's not even that much.
But we keep finding new ones all the time. And it's estimated that there are probably somewhere in the ballpark of 1 million species.
Yeah, that's more like it.
And so just for context,
Wow.
There's, probably somewhere around 1.2, maybe a little higher, million species described by science so far. Modern species. So that means that beetles, at least of described species, beetles make up 40% of all insects and around 25% of all animal species.
That's...
Yeah. This is a big group of animals. We are going to do a bad job covering them because there are way too many of them.
When we say there's different species of beetle, what makes a species different from another species of beetle?
Oh,
you don't even want to get taxonomy? Don't even get me started.
So we've had a couple. Granted, they were some of our earlier episodes, but we've had a couple of episodes about like what is a species, and
right.
It is very difficult. That question does not have a single good answer. There are some answers that are better than others, depending on how you want to use it. The way most people use it for living species, so like not fossil species, is what's called the biological species concept. Basically, if two populations cannot interbreed, they are different species. And that could be, all, for lack of a better term, all the parts line up and would fit, and even like the sperm and egg are compatible. But, for example, I know in frogs, there are some frogs where that's the case, where like, by all means, they should be able to reproduce, but species A has a different call. So like the males, when they croak or whatever, is different than in species B. And the females of each species know which call they want. And behaviorally, that makes them different species. Even though the machinery of reproduction would probably work if they did mate, but they just behaviorally don't. Let alone if the machinery does not work with each other. So, yeah, that is usually what people mean, is that two populations that cannot interbreed and produce viable offspring.
And we're pretty sure there are at least 400,000 up to 1 million.
Yep.
Oh, jeez. All right.
Yep. That's beetles. And so there is some debate around some other groups of insects that are a little bit less studied, or at least where that they live in places that are harder to do good research on, such as like the only two groups that are really thrown around where they could be contenders for, overtaking beetles are the Lepidoptera, which are moths and butterflies, and the Hymenoptera, which are ants, bees, and wasps. Those two are probably also in the millions ballpark. But as for described species, it's considerably less. But yeah, so for now, beetles all the way, and that's just what we're gonna agree upon. I know there are some entomologists who will be angry with me about that. Get over it. Also, I really like beetles because they're a great way of showing why the academic community has largely moved away from the sort of classic version of Linnaean taxonomy. The, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, beetles make up the order Coleoptera. That single order has, like I said, at least 400,000 species. Humans are in the order Primates. So again, order, same rank. And that only has about 400 to 500 total species. Manatees are in the order Sirenia, and that whole order only has 4 species. And aardvarks, such as, what was the cartoon one?
Arthur,
thank you. Arthur, the aardvark, they are in the order Tubulidentata, which has just the one species. Just
Nice.
the one. And so having all of these groups classified as orders on the same taxonomic rank kind of implies some degree of equality between them. But no matter how you look at them, all these groups are wildly different in sizes. So many things that were sort of listed and originally described as orders or other ranks are often kind of referred to their name these days. And this is just a fun thing I like pointing out about science, that, like, as we've talked about many times on the show, continuing your education in science is basically just a systematic refutation of lies. In high school biology, you're taught kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. There's at least, I think, like 27 different officially named levels within that, let alone all the things in between those that are just called clades. We have several episodes about that. If I were a better host, I would have put these in the episode numbers in the show notes, but I didn't. Anyway, go to literally any Wikipedia page for any group of animals, and you'll see lots of things in between order and family, for example. Anyway, digression aside, what makes a beetle? What makes a beetle different than any other insect? So I'm going to put something in the chat for you guys to look at, just for you to provide a little feedback. So beetles are holometabolous insects. That's most insects. Meaning that they have the sort of classic 3-step metamorphosis from like larva to pupa to adult. They don't really wrap themselves up like you think of with like some moths or butterflies, though, or the classic Pokemon, like Caterpie to Metapod to Butterfree. There's going to be several Pokemon references in this episode, because Pokemon was heavily inspired by insect collecting. The people who like created Pokemon were very avid insect collectors. So there's a lot of very heavy insect influence in Pokemon for that reason. And so basically the way their metamorphosis works is that basically when they get to a point, when the larva gets to a certain point, they sort of just shed and are different after the shed. So the link that I sent the two of you is, I believe, So because I have a pet lizard who eats insects, I have been sort of farming, basically, a species of beetles, mealworms, for a couple years. And the pupas are sort of like a weird regular bug where like you can still see what's gonna turn into the legs and where the head is and everything. So it's not like a caterpillar cocoon or anything. It just sort of looks like a weird, slightly deformed version of an adult beetle.
Yeah.
And so again, kind of oversimplified, but that's kind of how it works. They don't sort of turn into goo and then emerge a butterfly like you think of. That's basically how caterpillar metamorphosis works. Not quite the same. Yeah, so the caterpillars, a little bit of a digression, and I didn't do any like research on this, so I may be misremembering a couple things. But yeah, so the caterpillar basically turns into this cocoon, right? It depends on the species. Sometimes like the ones that make silk and things will like wrap themselves up in silk. And then the internal organs basically just turn into goo. And then all the cells know how to reorganize themselves to become then a butterfly. Yeah, very strange. I don't understand it. Again, I did not look it up. This is not what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's just sort of where the type of insect that beetles are. That is, most insects have that sort of 3-step, I guess 4-step, egg, larva, pupa, adult. Some others that don't, for example, are like dragonflies. They don't have a middle step. They don't have a pupa. They just go from egg, larva, adult. Yeah, so what makes beetles different from these other insects? The main thing is their wings. So think of a dragonfly, how it has the 4 wings that are that kind of like window pane sort of thing where they're mostly see-through. You have sort of the front pair and then the back pair. That's sort of the default for all winged insects. Some, like flies, for example, have mostly gotten rid of one of the pairs and mainly just use 2 wings to fly. Beetles sort of did that, in that they evolved sort of the front pair of wings into a protective covering that covers the actual flight wings. So if you, I'll put another link in the chat here. If you can picture a ladybug or ladybird or whatever people call them where you live.
Wait, do people not call them ladybugs?
What?
No, different people in different parts of the world and part of the country call them ladybirds, ladybugs. Yeah, there are
language is
different words.
weird.
Yeah. So the red and black part with the spots, that is actually a pair of wings that you think of as like a bug shell. But no, that is a pair of wings. And this structure is called an elytra. It is totally unique to beetles. So if you see an insect that, like, if it's ever flying or you can't, like, directly see their wings, but you know it can fly, that's probably a beetle. I mean, just statistically, if you see an insect, it's probably a beetle. But yeah, so this structure is really interesting and really cool because it allows beetles to do a lot of things. Mostly get into tight places without the risk of damaging their wings. Yeah. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, dragonflies are some of the most basal insects, as like most quote unquote primitive insects, because they can't sort of fold their wings down along their bodies. They're either to the side or folded like straight up over their back, if you have ever like watched a dragonfly for a length of time. And that really limits where they can go. But with beetles, they have not only wings that they can fold along their back to be able to squeeze places, they also have that protective covering to make sure when they do squeeze into places, their wings don't get damaged. And to an insect, if your wings get damaged, you are lunch. And because speaking of flying a little bit in their wings, beetles are not really known to be the best flyers. But if you look up videos online of them flying in slow motion, it is really cool because first they have to sort of pop open their elytra, that their covered wings. So they sort of pop those open like a car hood. And then the flight wings sort of fold out. Because when they are like sort of stored, they fold in a very particular way, kind of like origami almost. So when you see them unfold in like slow motion, it looks like somebody's like undoing a piece of origami. And then when they take off, they sort of jump with their hind legs, and then their front two pairs of legs don't really have anything to do. So they just kind of, hold them out like they're Superman. It's very fun to watch. So they're not very elegant flyers, but most species of beetles can fly. Even the ones that I keep, I think technically can fly, but I've never seen them do it. So how flight happy beetles are depends a lot on the species. Mine, like I said, to help prevent like mite infections and stuff. Anybody who keeps any kind of not warm-blooded thing has to be very concerned about mites all the time. And so I basically leave the top of their little tank open all the time. So hypothetically, all the adults could just fly out, but they never do.
What?
Yeah, I was worried about it at first, but I've had them for years, and I've never seen them do it.
Oh my gosh!
So
learning a lot.
So
today.
you just have a bare open like bug bowl.
I mean, so those like the plastic like clear drawers that you would get at Walmart or something, like the little tower of storage drawers. They're basically one of those. Yeah, and I just leave the drawer like a quarter open so they can have some airflow.
Wow.
And they never fly out.
That's wild. And you keep it inside or outside?
Yeah. Inside.
Whoa.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're warm. They have food. Where do they need to go?
Yeah, that's fair. That's totally fair.
But yeah, so there are others, like, for example, we'll talk about them in quite a bit of detail later, but fireflies. The fireflies are beetles. They can, at least the males, can fly quite well. And are very famous for flying because that's mostly when people see them doing their flashing in their light show. But yeah, so that is sort of the main thing that beetles are famous for, because as we'll talk about in a little bit, all the other different ways they use their elytra for display, for breathing, kind of, we'll talk about it. Beetles are also really well known for their defenses, because compared to a lot of other insects, they tend to have a little bit thicker of an exoskeleton, and then especially with the elytra, that's basically like a second exoskeleton along their back, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And they can also be quite big. They can be some of the largest insects. Some species, like the Goliath beetle, it's found in some like tropical regions of Africa, can be almost a quarter of a pound, which that's an insect weighing as much as your hamburger.
Ugh.
At least the meat. At least the meat.
You just had to go there, Gavin.
Yep, sure did.
I'm glad he did.
Yeah. And they can be like 5 inches long, so it's like that's a hefty insect. The adult or the larvae of the Goliath beetle can be even a little heavier, and they are. We'll talk about beetle larvae in a little bit, but the Goliath beetle, the larvae are basically just grubs. Which, if you know what that term means, you'll know how gross a quarter-pound grub would be.
Yuck.
If you're an insect living on like the scale of the world that insects typically live on, even an insect that's like 1/8 of a pound, you're well outside the weight class of most other insect predators. So like beetles just can be quite large, and just by virtue of that, they are pretty well defended against most, small arthropod predators. Even some like, small lizards. My lizard could not eat it would probably
Yeah.
die if it tried to eat a quarter-pound beetle.
It would choke.
Yeah. Many beetles, as I sort of alluded to at the very beginning, are somewhat toxic. Although that's not really unique. A lot of insects are like that. But many beetles show their toxicity with aposematic coloring, especially on their elytra. That's when things that are potentially poisonous or otherwise dangerous are like brightly colored. So, for example, that's potentially why bees are yellow. They're bright colors is just sort of a universal thing to predators, like, hey, don't mess with me. That's why like poison dart frogs are the colors that they are. And many beetles have white and other bright color stripes along their elytra to warn predators, and they can even many beetles will pop those open, pop open the hood of the car and flash them at predators to be like, hey, don't eat me, I taste bad. Some beetles also have patterns on their elytra for mimicry, to even though that beetle might not be all that nasty, they can make themselves look like other beetles that are, or they can make themselves look like wasps or ants or any other number of things. Insect mimicry is truly insane, and we're not going to talk about it anymore. I believe we had a whole episode about mimicry not that long ago. But yeah, so that's a big use of the elytra, as well as to communicate different things to predators and to even others of their species. Some beetles use sort of noxious chemicals that aren't necessarily like toxic, but are just kind of irritants, kind of like how like skunk spray rarely kills the predator, but it's still very effective at what it does. And then there are some cases, like the species called the bombardier beetle. Excellent name. It has, on each side of its body, it has two special chemical sacs. Both sacs contain a bit of hydrogen peroxide that the beetle just naturally makes. And one of them contains a chemical called a hydroquinone, and the other one contains some catalyst enzymes. Basically, when the beetle's threatened, it sort of empties these two sacs into a chamber together, and the chemicals react to release a bunch of heat up to 100 degrees Celsius, the boiling point of water, and basically they spray boiling hydrogen peroxide at predators.
That's pretty awesome.
It's pretty great. And there's some other just like nasty smelling irritant compounds that they, spray out as well in that. But it's like, yeah, they just throw boiling hydrogen peroxide, so not just water, at predators. And, it works pretty well. Again, just sort of reiterating from a little earlier, some beetles just use their size, like the Hercules beetle, Heracross for the Pokemon fans out there, stag beetles, Pinsir for the Pokemon fans out there, and rhinoceros beetles. I don't think there's Pokemon for that. And others just have like a big horn off the front of their head, or like big spiky mandibles or something. And it's like, yeah, if a bird, or a decent sized lizard tried to eat it, not a lot it could do. If a spider tried to eat that, it would, or even like a small lizard, they'd be in for a real fight trying to eat some of these, bigger beetles. There's a group called click beetles that have a built-in catapult system on like their underside that they sort of keep like locked in place. And when they're threatened, they just unlock it and it flings them away from danger. No particular direction, but it's like anywhere's better than the mouth of a predator. So if it's threatened, it just unclicks and it makes like an audible like sound, and they just fling themselves out. So those are just some of the cool predator defense things that beetles get up to. I'm sure there are many more. And as you can well imagine, for a group consisting of at least 400,000 species, There's a beetle that lives its life in just about any way you can think of. Most beetles are detritivores, meaning they eat stuff like dead leaves on the forest floor, dead animal bits and pieces, including like stuff like poop, dung beetles, for example. Basically like micro scavengers, basically. Groups like scarab beetles, which dung beetles are in the scarab group. There's a whole group called carrion beetles that almost exclusively feed on, dead vertebrates and other stuff like that. In fact, paleontologists and in some fields of biology, we often keep colonies of carrion beetles because, or there's another group called dermestid beetles, because they are incredibly effective at cleaning a skeleton without disrupting the bones all that much. So if we're like, hey, we sure would like to look at this thing's skeleton, but we don't want to go to all the work of, filleting it or anything. We used to sometimes boil stuff a whole bunch to just get the meat and other stuff off of them. But we realized, hey, there's a bunch of bugs that will do this for us.
Yeah.
I know one of my old professors in grad school, she studied like decomposition, and she has a dermestid colony. I'm pretty sure I think she might send some samples out and things. I know at least where she went to graduate school, she had a dermestid colony. But yeah, it's like it's really cool that we're just like, hey, these things are way better at it than we could be ever. Yeah. So we just let them do it, and they're happy. They get food.
Yeah, that Andy told me that like when he has like a deer or something that he wants to keep ahead of, he'll just like throw it in like the yard and let like the ants get it or something, which is wild.
Yeah. Carrion beetles are also sort of potentially useful for forensics. If somebody finds a dead body, one of the ways you can try to determine how long the body was there is by looking at sort of the life cycle of the carrion beetles found on the body. So it's like, well, if there's a bunch of eggs but no larvae, this must be relatively fresh. If there's, this ratio of larvae to eggs, it's been this long. If there's this ratio of eggs to larvae to pupae, it's been here this long. So beetles are useful for a lot of things. Many are herbivorous, eating anything from flowers to potato plants to trees. If they can wiggle their way under the bark, many are very good at that. Some species, like the Colorado potato beetle, are major agricultural pests. And then there's some species like the emerald ash borer. If you live in the northeastern United States, you've probably heard of that one. That are invasive and cause big problems for local plants where they have invaded. That species is native to like the like North Pacific area of like Asia, so like Japan, the Koreas, China, places like that. And over there, it's just like it lives in the ash trees, but like there's stuff that can find it and eat it. Over here, there's not any animals that are used to doing that, so they just decimate ash tree populations.
Jeez.
On the positive side, some beetles are really good pollinators, especially in some more arid places like Southern California or like Sub-Saharan Africa. And beetles, I didn't find anything more on this, but it seems like they're really attracted to like certain colors of flowers. Like most beetle populated or pollinated flowers tend to be bright green or like off-white. I don't know. I didn't see any follow-up on that. But beetles, based on that, seem to not have like terrific vision. I even tried to look up stuff about their vision and didn't really find too much. But they're very heavily scented as well, so they tend to navigate, seemingly more by scent than by sight. And then there are some beetles that are purely carnivorous and like active hunters, not just like scavengers, and eat like smaller insects or things like earthworms. There are some species of those carrion beetles or scarabs that are carnivorous and will hunt other members of their group that come to eat the dead stuff. So they'll also seek out dead stuff, but not to eat the dead stuff, to eat the things that come to eat the dead stuff. They're lifestyles, so just like where they live, how they do their thing, also vary widely. Most beetles operate kind of how you would expect a beetle to, just kind of walking around on forest floors, eating up dead leaves, poop, stuff like that. Some species are aquatic. There's like quite a lot of aquatic beetles. And they all kind of do things in like a slightly different way because they're not all that closely related to each other. And they use their elytra in very interesting ways with this. So insects don't have lungs like we do. They basically have a series of holes just on the side of their bodies that air flows in and out of. But they don't have like an active pump like we do with our lungs. So
So how does oxygen get into their blood vessels then?
It just passively diffuses because they're small enough to be able to get away with that.
Jealous.
Yeah. So they don't have because of that, in low oxygen environments they can kind of struggle. Or even like really fine powders. That's why a lot of like bug or insect repellents or like ant stuff that you like put around your house is like a really fine powder because it gets into their breathing holes and clogs it up. But yeah, so how a lot of these aquatic beetles work is they will surface and then open their elytra, and they have these little tiny hairs on the inside of the wing covers that are like water repellent. And so they sort of trap an air bubble under their elytra. And their breathing holes are sort of along their back, usually covered by the elytra. So they basically can surface, open their elytra, close them, and then dive and just make their own little personal scuba tank.
Whoa.
And it's even cooler than that because it's not like fully sealed. Like the little hairs makes, water has some weird things with its physics and its surface tension that you can do. So you can keep it inside the elytra without fully sealing it off, meaning that air bubble is still exposed to some water and can passively just absorb oxygen from the water.
Whoa.
So they can use this bubble to basically turn it into like gills with extra steps.
That's crazy.
And they can still, it was really cool when I was reading about this. That kind of blew my mind. And they still can go up on land and function more or less like a totally normal beetle. Their legs are adapted for swimming, so they can't walk all that great. But yeah, so they can stay underwater way longer than they normally would be able to if they did just sort of make a sealed chamber in their elytra for it. Really cool. Others sort of do it a little differently, where they have those tiny hairs all over their body instead of just under the elytra. And that just sort of makes like their own little personal bubble. And similar thing, that bubble can just passively absorb some oxygen from the water. And so, again, just sort of gills with extra steps. Most adult beetles look fairly similar to one another. There are some very obvious exceptions, like the ones with like the big horns and stuff. But while the adults look fairly similar to one another across the entire group, the larvae look quite different depending on the family. For example, the species that I raise, mealworms, look more or less like kind of hard-bodied little worms. They're like long and relatively skinny. Their head, they're basically just like a cylinder. They're like the same like width all the way down. And their head is just like slightly darker colored than the rest of them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only way you can really tell which end's the head. And they have these little teeny tiny legs up front. Others are more similar to what most people would call grubs. And so imagine sort of the squishy bugs that Simba eats after he joins Timon and Pumbaa in The Lion King. The
Yeah.
slimy yet
Yeah.
satisfying.
Ugh.
Those are what many beetle larvae look like. Basically maggots, but with a dark-colored head and usually a pretty large set of mandibles.
Mm-hmm.
Others, I couldn't find a great way to describe these ones, so I'll put it in the chat, and you guys can tell me what you think. These, the only way I could think of to describe them is that they kind of just look like a wrong ant.
Hold on. I'm trying to open it. Oh.
Like the head kind of looks like an ant.
Yes.
And the body, the thorax, so the second part after the head that the legs come out of, also kind of looks like an ant. But then the abdomen is just like long and has a bunch of like segments in it. Those are the larvae of some beetles.
We have...
Instead of being like a grub or a little worm thing, this one's like still a mostly functional insect. These are like some of the ones that live in like a lot of the aquatic ones are like this because they still need to function pretty well in the water. Some of the ones that live in like still living trees look like this. It varies a lot from family to family. And then a couple beetle just highlights that I thought were neat. Didn't really fit anywhere else in the previous section. So before we get into like the paleontology and the evolution, a couple just like highlights. First, as I mentioned earlier, fireflies are beetles. I like fireflies a lot.
Yeah.
Famously, they are bioluminescent. That's where the fire in fireflies comes from. But the reason that I found them to be so neat, especially after looking into them a little bit for this episode, contrary to the fire in their name, the light that they produce is so efficient that it produces no heat.
Whoa, that's crazy. None?
None.
So they're like little LEDs?
Even better, because LEDs are even only 90% efficient.
Wow.
All right, Mr. Pedantic.
Yeah, well, and the reason I know that is because I have that in the notes here in just a second. Basically, anytime we humans produce light, we produce a lot of heat. For example, the typical incandescent light bulb, the kind that most people had in their homes 10, 15 years ago, those are only like 10% efficient at best. So if you have a 100-watt light bulb, or a 100-watt incandescent light bulb, it gives off 90 watts of infrared light, heat, instead of visible light. And then right here in my notes, even LEDs are only about 90% efficient. So they still give off, 10% of the energy you put into them as heat instead of light. And fireflies are just cool. Because they evolved this basically 100% efficient way to do, like, the thing that they're known for.
Yeah, that's crazy to have such a high efficiency.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to wrap my head a little bit around the chemistry of how they do it. I was unsuccessful. Potentially we could do a fireflies episode because there are a ton of them. And they actually have a surprisingly good fossil record.
Oh, cool.
So maybe in the future. But mostly what fireflies use this for is to talk to each other. Mostly for attracting mates. Once again, going back to Pokemon, the Pokemon Volbeat and Illumise are fireflies. So Volbeat, the Pokemon, can only be male, and Illumise can only be female. Volbeat is the one that lights up, and that's how it works in nature as well. In many species, the males are the ones you see flying around. Sort of like in mosquitoes, how like the females are the ones that bite you. Whereas male mosquitoes are basically just like a regular type of fly. But yeah, the males are the ones that fly around and light up and stuff because they're trying to attract females. In many species, the females are basically larvae. Like, they still metamorphose, they still have a pupa stage, but they don't, like, grow wings and fly around. They stay, like, in the shape of a larva. and a lot of them still have a light organ to signal to the males. And so how exactly the male knows that she's blinking at them, I don't know. They also do a lot of stuff with pheromones, so that's probably part of it. But yeah, the ones you see flying around are males. The ones you see like on the ground, if you've ever seen a firefly light up from like a tree branch or something, or even just the ground, that's probably a female. In some species, the females are predatory and will mimic the light pattern of another species to lure in males to eat them.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love when there's like trickery going on amongst the animal kingdom.
Oh, yeah. The larvae are also bioluminescent, and it's thought that that's probably how it got started, because they'll flash to sort of deter predators and scamper away. And so it's thought that somewhere along the lines, they had a mutation that like kept the glowing through metamorphosis, and that's kind of how that got started. See some other just cool things, not about fireflies, but about some other beetles. A few groups are parasites. Not surprising, given insects. Some are parasitoid, meaning, we talked about it a little bit because we had a whole episode about parasites. Parasitoid means you're not like a tick where you just sort of attach yourself and suck the blood of something. Parasitoid means that like you find the larva of something else, you lay your eggs inside of it, and then your eggs hatch and eat the thing from within. So it's like long-term predatory. Some have symbiotic relationships with fungus, where they sort of will plant a specific type of fungus in like a dead tree along with some of their eggs. And then while the eggs grow, the fungus will break down the wood around them. And then when the eggs hatch, they'll eat the fungus that's been, growing that whole time. Then they'll turn into adults, take some of the fungus with them to use for their own eggs. Some that live in deserts have really specialized structures on their elytra that sort of concentrate water, just like the structure of them, that like when the wind blows over them in a certain way, it'll make them gather water. What little water there is in the desert air will sort of collect on their elytra, and they can use that to drink from. And then lastly, one species of beetle is eusocial, like ants and like some bees are. And it's a single species of weevil in Australia that live inside eucalyptus trees and farm fungus. And they have like a colony structure, kind of like ants do. Which is, eusociality is very rare outside of like the ants, bees, and wasps group. It's pretty much just termites, a couple weird one-off species like this beetle, and then naked mole rats for some reason.
That's so random.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, we could have a whole episode about naked mole rats. That'd be a fun episode. All right, on to the evolution. So, arthropods were some of the first animals to really make a go at life on land. It was sometime potentially as early as the late Cambrian period, so around 490 million years ago, episode 50, for more on the Cambrian period. But for sure, it was by sometime in the Silurian period, around 425 million years ago, episode 66 for the Silurian period. But yeah, so around that time, there were fully terrestrial arthropods. And these weren't necessarily insects yet. Those were things like millipedes, crustaceans, like isopods, things like that. And then the groups that would eventually, evolve into spiders, scorpions, and then actual insects. The first, full true insects show up in the early parts of the Devonian period, around 415 million years ago, episode 72. And with them sort of evolving flight. So for that they didn't start out flying. There are like a couple of insect groups that never evolved wings. But those are like the really basal ones. Yeah, so they evolved flight sometime in the Carboniferous period, which is a time that's famous for like hawk-sized giant dragonflies. Very fun. See episode 21 about flight, going way back, and episode 81 about the Carboniferous period. Beetles themselves, so that's just insects in general, just laying a little groundwork. Beetles first show up in the early Permian period, sometime around 297 or so million years ago. Episode 89 for the Permian period. And they were sort of the first group of insects to really diversify in like a noticeable way in the fossil record. The first group of beetles are a polyphyletic group, and then in my notes I put parentheses bad, called the Protocoleoptera, so just early beetles. A polyphyletic group is basically like a group of animals that like aren't directly all that closely related, but it's like, well, we don't have enough information to call them anything else, so we're just gonna lump them in this wastebasket group name and just give them that name. We'll figure it out later, is basically what a polyphyletic group is. So this group is really interesting because looking at the fossils, we have a couple of really like excellently preserved fossil sites from around this time, the early Devonian, that give us like excellent insect fossils. And they show clear development of the elytra as like a pair of wings, where it's like clearly nearly as like hard as like the rest of the beetle, but it still has that kind of like window pane structure of like a normal insect wing. So it's cool that you can kind of see that transition in these like very first beetle fossils. And they seem, mostly by like looking at their mouth parts and stuff, that they seem to be mostly wood eating and living like inside of trees. The first groups of modern beetles that we still have today show up in the late Permian. And then the end Permian mass extinction happens. The worst mass extinction ever.
No.
Yeah, so right when the beetles first start really going at it, then the big one comes. And pretty much all of that, the early beetle group, the wastebasket group, go extinct. A few of them make it, but not a lot of them. So from that point on into the Triassic, then it's sort of just the modern quote-unquote beetles. Episode 98 for the Triassic period. Once we get into the Jurassic period, now we're in the ballpark of 210 to 145 million years ago. Episode 107. That's when beetles start to evolve like the more varied, at least diets. It's here when they start to become more carnivorous, and we can see that by looking at their mouth parts, and eating plants besides wood. Eating leaves, eating, just other plant material besides like specifically wood. And they increase in diversity quite a lot in the Jurassic period, likely being sort of the most common insects. Although by this point, flies, moths, butterflies, and wasps also would have been pretty common. And then we get into the Cretaceous period, 145 to 66 million years ago, episode 113. And that's when beetles start to live like different lifestyles, basically, like being aquatic, being poop specialists. So like during the Cretaceous, we also start to get really good quality amber, which really helps out a lot in understanding the evolution of insects. Amber is like a godsend for, people who study insect evolution. And I think technically we have, a handful of spots where you can get amber older than the Cretaceous period, but it's really during the Cretaceous when we start to get a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and it's also just cool to think that like there were dung beetles that were rolling dinosaur poop around. It's pretty cool. One of the last things to sort of talk about with the Cretaceous here, that's when we see the rise of flowering plants, which are, the main group of plants that we have around today. And these plants have been a major boon to basically all insect species. But beetles don't quite take to it as well as things like ants or flies or like butterflies do. Like we said earlier, there are some that are pollinators. There are some that like eat fruit that's made by flowering plants, but they don't quite take to it as well as some of the other insect groups. Not really sure why. Then we have the end Cretaceous mass extinction, and we start to see pretty much all of like the modern families and things like that of beetles. And then by the time we get to the Miocene epoch, about 5.7 is towards the end of the Miocene, about 5.7 million years ago. Episode coming soon. We basically see like the exact same beetles we have today. So even like almost 6 million years ago, we have potentially the same species we have around today. And it's thought that part of why beetles are so diverse today is some of the weird climate fluctuations that have happened in the last dozen million years or so. A lot of just the weird climate stuff caused a lot of habitat fracturing, and just the basic, the thing you learn about in, 9th grade biology, genetic drift. If two populations of the same species are separated for long enough, they will just naturally become different species. And it's thought that because of all of this habitat fracturing, that's why we have so many beetles. And that they're all, the ones that are in the same groups are all like pretty closely related to each other. So the beetles being as diverse as they are might just be have only been a thing for the last few million years. And I just thought that was pretty cool how climate, especially for relatively immobile groups of animals, can be that big of a factor.
Yeah.
I mean that it's almost unsurprising to me just thinking about how like climate is going to affect every kind of animal, especially for me, I'm always thinking about like these extremophiles at the bottom of the ocean,
right.
But just like regardless of what the environment is, biology will adapt. Whatever the quote from Jurassic Park is.
Life finds a way, I believe.
Yeah,
I believe
that's the
that
one.
Is the quote from Jeff Goldblum.
Yeah, that's the one.
But yeah, so like I said, after about 6 million years ago, we have pretty much the same beetles we have today.
Wow.
But yeah, so beetles are just interesting because like they're so diverse, they're so old. Like I said, like the first like insect group to really start doing well, noticeably well in the fossil record. And they're still just super neat. Like there are so many different, like I said, the adults, a lot of them have a fairly similar shape. And then there's just some others like weevils who just have like a weirdly long like snoot. That's not like a horn like rhinoceros beetles or something. They just have like a really long face. And that's just kind of their thing. And each group of beetles has something that is like their thing. And they're just, a lot of them are like really pretty colors. A lot of them are like iridescent.
Yeah.
I know there's a type of invasive beetle here in the Northeast that like I'm always sad. I forget its name, but it's like a really pretty like green blue iridescent color, and I always get sad because they're so pretty to look at. But they're invasive. Even that emerald ash borer is like it looks like it's covered in glitter. It's like green emerald and like sparkly. So it's a shame that it's so invasive. But anyway, at this point I'm rambling. And that's pretty much all I got about beetles.
And I am quite certain we could go a lot further if you wanted to.
Yeah. I mean, just like
time.
beetles, there's we could make this the longest episode of the podcast in honor of the most diverse group of animals, but I don't really want to do that because I'm trying to get sleep before Election Day.
You're adorable. Well, Gavin is trying to get sleep, and the rest of the world, who knows what happens to the rest of the world when the next time we see you, but we'll see you guys in 2 weeks for another episode of I Wish You Were Dead, the podcast about things that used to be alive. Until then, take care, everybody.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Fenella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.